Welcome to Module 18. Module 18 takes a step away from generating output like we did in version 16 in chapter 16 and 17 to dealing with a subject that comes up an awful lot and is a subject of, shall we say, discussion in many Intelligent Advisor projects. Because when you're starting to work with Intelligent Advisor, this is one of those areas where you think, I'm not entirely sure what this means, and I don't know how I should react when someone says, we need temporal reasoning. So the aim of this chapter is to demystify what temporal reasoning is, give you some concrete examples of when you should use it, and also hopefully help you identify times when you don't need to use it. Because it's one of those features that is somewhat overused unnecessarily. That said, it is a very sophisticated topic, and we'll be revisiting this in a later chapter, and we'll take some more sophisticated examples. But our goal here is to draw a line and say this is when, this is how, and this is why. So what is temporal reasoning? That's going to be the main subject. Why is it important? What can I use it for? What shouldn't I use it for? How can I use it in my Word and my Excel documents? And basically give you enough to make informed decisions about whether you need temporal attributes, whether you need to convert them to or from other attributes, everything you need as a little toolkit, if you will. So let's start with the obvious. What is meant by temporal reasoning? Well, instead of saying what is meant by temporal reasoning, let's start with the whole concept of temporal data to begin with. If I have a colleague and I ask my colleague, how old are you? And they say, I'm 25. Whether I believe them or not, they say 25. Let's imagine that their birthday is tomorrow. And I come back 2 days later and I ask them, how old are you? And they give me a different answer. They say 26. Some data changes over time. Your age is a good one, but there's many more things that are temporal in nature. It's not a static value. A very good example that I can relate to, and I'm sure you can, is how much money do you have in your bank account? That's a question that should really be, how much money do you have in your bank account now, today? Or how much money did you have in your bank account last Tuesday? Or last Wednesday? Or basically, without an element of date or a date element, this information is not really fully exploitable. So anytime you come across data that changes along a timeline, you can think of it visually as a timeline. You can think of it as your bank balance goes up, probably down, and up again, payday, back down, and so on. And this is across time. This chronological idea, that's a great example of temporal data. Because without the notion of time passing, the question, what's in your bank account, is not really useful. If you understood what temporal data is, you'll probably get what we mean by temporal reasoning. If you need to take that chronological data and work with it in some way, if you need to ask questions like, how much money did you have in your bank account on Tuesday the 3rd of June? You can only do that if you have this temporal vision. If you need to ask questions like, when was the last time you had less than 0 in your account for more than 5 days? Clearly, looking for that consecutive period of 5 days, you're going to want to move along this temporal thing. You move along this picture. You're getting an idea of the kind of things you want to do with temporal reasoning. Anytime you need to ask a question based on that timeline, you're doing temporal reasoning. I mentioned that it was kind of visualizable as a in your head, almost like a chronology or as a plan. Well, it actually is visualized that way too inside the debugger. So whenever you're working with temporal data, you have the ability to switch it to what they call temporal visualization. I'm going to switch briefly into Oracle Policy Modeling to create an attribute and just go back through those 3 key points that we've already discussed. That if you want to create an attribute, that is going to be used in temporal reasoning, it has to be able to have this concept of dates, and it has to be able to be visualized for debugging purposes. So I'm going to go back into the application. I'll go over here. And I'm going to create a new attribute, and it's going to be called the example temporal attribute. This is not a good name for an attribute, but it'll do. And it's going to be a number. I'll just change the spelling mistake I noticed there. Good. Okay. So there's the first revelation. Creating an attribute, whether it's temporal or not, is exactly the same. I included the word temporal in the name, in the attribute text, simply because I wanted to remind myself that it was a temporal attribute. But it's just an attribute. There's nothing special I have to do to make it work. So now I'm going to go into the debugger, and I'm going to just zoom in and focus only on that single attribute. So I'm going to go to the Data tab, and I'm going to go for the example, which I just created. There it is. So there's my example attribute. Should make things nice and clear. I'll make this screen nice and big so we can see it. So I'm going to double click this. This is nothing new. You've done this 1,000 times, and it says, what is the example temporal attribute? I'm going to type in 100. So this attribute has a value. This value has no notion of time. It's just a value. So right now, this is not at all temporal in nature. This is just an ordinary attribute with a value. I'm going to go back in, and I'm going to click on change points. I'm going to say, well, now you mention it, yes, today the value is 250 actually, and tomorrow it's going to be 270, and let's put one in for yesterday. Let's do yesterday. Monday was 135. Now we're getting somewhere. Now we've been able to state that this attribute doesn't have one value. It has an array of values depending on what date you're talking about. So this is now including temporal data. If I right-click, I have the option to show in temporal visualization. And when I switch to temporal visualization, I can see it in a chronological form. It says, well, you started off by telling me it was 100, so I'm going to assume that unless you tell me otherwise, the value to begin with was 100. But then you told me on the 6th it was 135. I appreciate that we can't quite see the 135, but I remember it was 135. Then you said on the 7th it was 250, and now you said tomorrow it's going to be the 270. So this is a temporal display. This is temporally visualizing the value of this attribute. It's not one value, it's a value that changes over time. So now you've worked out probably where this is going to go. I'm going to say, well, what was the value on the 6th of July? The value was 135. That's an example of temporal reasoning. Can you tell me, have I had a value of greater than 200 for more than 3 days? No, because I can see only 2 days worth there. So these are examples of temporal reasoning. And you need to be able to make those kind of assessments if you're dealing with bank statements, but also personal circumstances. Have you been married for more than 6 months? Well, that assumes that we know when they got married. Of course, that might be easy to answer, but have you had more than 3 children for more than 6 months? Or have you had a job for at least 3 months in the last 12 months? All of these are going to rely on our ability to scan across a chronology. So let's return to our presentation. And what I wanted you to notice is that when you're in the debugger, you can just see it here, I think. Temporal data appears in a specific format. It appears in curly brackets. So whenever you see curly brackets, you'll notice that that's a temporal data. You'll also notice sometimes that you'll see uncertain in there or unknown because, well, you maybe have calculated something that is not giving an answer, or simply you haven't provided data for any period before the 6th of July. If I go back to my application one more time, and I go back to my attribute, and I could simply say that its value is unknown, what that means is, when I go to the temporal visualization, you'll notice that before the date that marks the start of the chronology is now white. Nothing was known until the 6th of July. So be prepared for unknown and uncertain to find its way into your temporal data. And that's okay too. Indeed, in some temporal reasoning, the presence of uncertain data or unknown data is itself why you're asking the question. For those of you who are interested in how Intelligent Advisor communicates with other applications, even if you're not using an interview, if you're using a web services can both send and can be sent and can send back temporal data. They have their own little tags in XML or in JSON instead of the curly brackets. So this concept of temporal data relies upon change points. You saw me enter 2 or 3 change points. Once I create change points, I'm now dealing with temporal data. You don't always need temporal data, and it frustrates many users sometimes when they go through the trouble of creating temporal data and someone comes along and says, well, actually you didn't need that. You know, if all you've got is the date of birth of someone and you want to know if they are at least 16 years old, you have a date of birth, you have today's date. You can say, what's the difference between today's date and their date of birth? That's not temporal, that's simple logic saying, what's the difference in days or the difference in years between these two dates? It does take a little while to get used to the fact that you only need it really when you want to scan up and down this chronology for some reason. Typically, it's not needed unless you have rules of a policy where they change over time. For example, if you have a personal circumstance where you're sometimes employed, sometimes unemployed, sometimes volunteering, those changes in circumstances could mark whether you receive a benefit or not. So we need to be able to scan across that chronology looking for when you were employed or unemployed, or where you have data that makes the policy work that changes. For example, you have an interest rate for your savings, and it only applies if you leave the money in your account for at least 6 months. Or you have an unemployment benefit that was set at a certain figure in 2019 and will change to 2020 and will change to 2021. Or you have more money when you have more children, and so on and so on and so on. So that would be the case that it's really the nuts and bolts of the policy that change over time. So sometimes it's the output that's temporal, sometimes it's the input elements that are temporal. So you're thinking, okay, fine. But sometimes you need to create temporal data because you don't have it, but you need it. Let's look at a concrete example. I'm going to switch back to the application to discuss this one. First things first, I'm going to stop the debugger for a moment, and I'm going to go back to my example temporal attribute, and I'm going to remove it because it was just an example. I want you to notice that I have an entity here called the bank statement line. It is a normal, ordinary, everyday entity, and it has a number of attributes, including the line, the transaction type, numeric, line date, line amount, running balance, and so on. Nothing clever about this to begin with. So I'm going to go into my debugger, and I'm just going to enter. I'm going to use the data tab because I don't actually have any screens. I'm going to go to my statement lines, and I'm going to add 3 lines to my statement. Line number 1, I'm going to say that, let's do it this way. We'll say the bank statement line is line number 1. And let's say that it was the 1st of January. Make sure I'm looking at the right keyboard. Let's say it was the 1st of January this year. And let's say, happy event, it was a credit. And the amount is 200 whatevers. And then I'll go to line number 2. You can understand why I didn't do 30 of these. And we'll say it's the next day. And let's say withdrawal. And I withdrew 30. And I'll finish off with my final line, line number 3, and this was on 1st of February, and let's say that it was a credit because it was payday, and I received 200. Good, so far so good. I have 3 bank statement lines. Line number 1, which was 200 credit, line number 2, which was 30 withdrawal, and line number 3, which is another 200 credit. And I'm calculating the running the balance as I go along, so I know that I had 400 in credit and 30 in withdrawal, so I must have 370 left. Fine. So this is non-temporal data. So I can't visualize this in the format that I want to. In order to be able to visualize this as temporal data, I need to transform these instances into temporal data. And you can do that, and there's functionality to let you do that. So there's an attribute here called the bank balance in temporal format, and this attribute has taken the data and converted it into something temporal. How does it do it? We'll go and take a look. It uses a function which is one of several functions that are in the same family. So I'm only going to show it to you briefly because there are many of them and their functionality is pretty straightforward. The bank balance in temporal format equals temporal from start date. So I'm saying, okay, I'm going to give you a bunch of data and each one is going to have a date on it, and you should consider that as a starting date. So if you can think of it as the date on which the value applied. And I'm going to give you bank statement lines, look at each date, and look at the running balance, because the running balance is the amount of money that I'm interested in. So it's going to work through that, and it's going to convert my 3 instances into a temporal visualization. So now I have the same data expressed as temporal, and you're thinking, so what? There are 3 reasons why this is good. 1, it's way easier to analyze one attribute which has a timeline than it is to scan through multiple instances searching for a value. 2, there's a whole bunch of functions dedicated now to extracting data out of here. For example, if I return to my Word document a second time, if I turn to my project and I go to my other Word document, I can leverage functions like interval consecutive days to assess the timeline and say, has the customer had a balance of more than 100 for at least 10 days? I can use simple non-temporal reasoning to find the earliest date in the statements or the last date in the statements. I can also use, and in the debugger, when I return to the Data tab, I can see, for example, the customer has had a balance of more than 100 for 10 days because I can read the earliest date in the statement, the latest date in the statement, and then I can scan through the temporal reasoning to say, well, this was one date, this was one date, this was one date, and so on. Because you'll recall that the 3rd transaction was on the 1st of February. So between the 2nd of January and the 1st of February, I had more than 100 units in my account. So I did meet that criteria. So we just saw interval consecutive days. There's actually a whole series of them that allow you to say, well, was it consecutive days for at least a certain number of days? All those kind of things that you want to do when you're looking at a timeline. We also have one that you probably guessed already existed, is value at. Tell me the value at a specific point in time. So if I'm making a request for a loan, and I'm making a request for the loan on the 4th of February, maybe there's what's known as a reference date. And the reference date is the 1st day of the current month. So we would say, we don't ask what's your value in your account today. We say, what was the value in your account on the 1st of the current month, which would be value at 1st of February, and look at my temporal bank balance. So far so good, I hope. A common question that comes up is, great, I've got temporal data, but now I need to convert it into non-temporal data. So in a sense, you want to do the reverse of what we just discussed when we talked about temporal from start date. Why would you want to do that? Well, it's because most external systems don't have a mechanism to manage temporal data. They're expecting you to send statement line number 1, statement line number 2, statement line number 3, statement line number 4, and so on. They're expecting tabular row-based data to be sent to them. So if you've got a temporal attribute and you need to convert it back into normal data, you can. It's a little more sophisticated. It requires you to use some of the entity functions that we looked at in previous chapters, and it's what we'll do in the demonstration at the end of this chapter. As a final point, this often comes up, is people are surprised that when they build an interview, there is no way to enter temporal data. You can add an attribute to your screen, and you can ask someone to enter a value, but there's no native way to ask them to enter a change date to be able to enter more values. So in an interview, you'll have to have a standard entity with standard instances and use the technique that we just discussed to convert that into temporal data. It is possible to create a temporal data control, but that would require customization and JavaScript. On the right-hand side of this page is an example of some customized JavaScript to display temporal data in a new way. This is a common request also. I want to display temporal data in a graphical format. So you'll see here, this is actually a timeline. What do I want you to remember? I want you to remember 3 things. Temporal data is simply data whose values change over time. And typically you would view it in the form of a chronology, like a chart with dates. Secondly, once you've mastered that concept, you will understand why sometimes you want to look at that chronology and ask questions about it. When did you last have more than £100 in your account? Or when did you last go overdrawn? Have you been in credit for the last 6 months? Just to use 3 examples from the bank. That's much, much easier to do if you have temporal data, because you can leverage temporal functions to perform temporal reasoning. And the second thing is that you can convert to and from temporal data. That's not a problem. And finally, if you want to display temporal data in an interview, you want to display a timeline or pictures or something or a carousel, you have JavaScript extensions at your disposal to do it. That's it. See you in a little while.